My name is Dustin Wheeler. My family calls me Duck Duck, and my love of wine created the Duck Vine. The joy and passion I have is a bottle of knowledge I want to share with you. Let me be your favorite sommelier and pour you a big glass of edutainment so you can sit back, swirl it, sniff it, and sip it as we ducks fly together through the wine world. Let's duck and go. Hello. How are all of you guys and gals doing? Welcome in to more of a regular scheduled program this evening. We're going to go into what the majority of you guys would call the domestic area. I do have a lot of listeners across the world, but the majority are from the U.S. And we're going to start tackling maybe some interesting regions. And probably you guys are going, oh, well, if you haven't read the title, but you're probably going, oh, we're talking United States wine. It's got to be California. I kind of want to flip the script a little bit. We're going to jump into Virginia as a wine region. When you look at Virginia, it has a huge history for different sakes, but could be seen as one of the larger jumping off points for wine and how the U.S. perceives wine comparative to any other state. Most of the times, I think, especially anyone that has general history and a little bit of wine history, you say Virginia, you say wine, the first thing that everyone's going to jump to is Thomas Jefferson. We all know he was a huge hero for wine, a huge advocate for wine. There's some different reasons. Some of it has been thought to have been he was trying to get the colonies off of reliance on British taxation and looking at other countries such as France and Italy to use their wines versus giving more money back to King George and his connections. We'll dive much further into those kind of ideas in our history version of the United States wine, or just history of wine in general. He's obviously still a huge impact, so he always gets noted in Virginia wine, but there's a lot more that happens than just Thomas Jefferson. So we'll talk about him, but we'll also talk about some other things. So wine really here goes back all the way to the colonial era. So like 1619, the town of Jamestown. I want to try to keep all the towns of this, and Jamestown passed an act or a decree or whatever they were referencing it at that point, where the colonists had to start planting vitis vinifera, or planting vineyards. As soon as they came over, a lot of the first colonists had a lot to do with alcohol and fermentation, whether it be in spirits or ales or wine. There was already that connection. So as soon as they came over, it started. However, though, they really had little success. Even Jefferson, as much as he wanted Virginia to be the birthplace of American wine, he never saw a vineyard make it through to produce a high quality wine. And even his own vineyards in Monticello estate never were successful. As soon as they were planted, they lost the vines. And we'll talk about part of that as we go through the podcast and why it's difficult and why some people automatically discount Virginia wines, which I think you'll see that you shouldn't be so quick to do that anymore, especially moving forward. So, as the colonists have started to try to get these grapes going, it's just not working. The phylloxera louse is in the soil here. All the European varietals that they're bringing over are just not able to establish themselves and set themselves up to be able to become fruitful and keep producing year after year. There are obviously some local grapes, but even within that, there's some challenges with the final product of those wines. People refer to those wines as being foxy, and there's a lot of differences in our native varieties versus the European varieties. And even when we look at the European varieties that are very successful in Virginia, they are not your typical structure. What I mean by that is if you look at like the Concord grapes and things like that that we have in the US, they're very thick-skinned, lots of sugar. They are very big grapes comparative to the grapes that you get in Europe. So even the percentage of skin to juice, the pulp, it's all completely different right off the bat. When you look at a typical wine bunch for Vitis vinifera, it could be anywhere from like 400 to 600 of those grapes are needed to make one bottle of wine. They're much smaller. Now, when you look at some of the bunches of Vitis vinifera, depending on the particular varietal, it can be very different in their structure and the denseness of those clusters. So stuff like Cap Franc or Petit Verdot is a little more airy. So it's not as dense, which helps out in Virginia because of some of the weather issues. Virginia is this unique area from how it's established, not only as a state, but from being all the way on the East Coast, going hundreds of miles across what we would refer to as a state to the Blue Ridge Mountains or the Appalachian Mountains, however you want to refer to it. It is, in some aspects, considered more northerly than most areas in the U.S., but at the same time isn't so far north that the summers still play a huge factor. So think about this. In one area, you're having a collection of grapes, and this is where some of the struggle has come for Virginia to become recognized as a top contender because of its diversity. And unfortunately, when we were first planting wines and grapevines for wine, they were a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of grapes being planted in a lot of areas just because I think this is similar, but as they learned, was not what they thought it was to start. And that was a big struggle and still is a struggle to this day, is making sure with the vines that they are using, that they're putting them in the areas to be the most successful. So even in the like 1980s, 1990s, which isn't that long ago, we're still figuring out where are the grapes going to be the most successful in Virginia? So, going back to the actual layout of the state, you're on the coast, sandy beaches. That's one area for how a grape would like to be or be successful in. You go all the way across the state, then you've ended up in the mountains. High elevation, colder temperatures, but even where the state sits in the U.S. isn't as far north as what we would think of as Burgundy or, obviously like Willamette, Oregon, Washington. It's a little bit more south. So the summers are brutal and they're humid. So I talked about a few seconds ago these grape varietals maybe not being as dense like the Petit Verdot and the Cab Francs. The grape bunches themselves actually have more holes or more area in between the berries in a cluster to allow air to pass through, which will help makers and growers help fight some mold and issues like that may occur when trying to grow these European grape bunches in an area that's not really the same kind of climate as the vines are used to. Now, with that, we've talked about these unique areas and what is really being grown there. I know that's got to be a question, and what's being successful. There's all kinds of things that are being grown in Virginia. Again, it's still coming down to where are they the most successful, but everything from Aglianico, Cab Franc, Cab Sauv, Chardonnays, Gewürztraminer, Nebbiolo, Petit Manseng, which is probably like one of the strongest grapes, which is a white grape. We'll talk just a little bit about in a few when we talk about grapes and areas and some of the divisions there. Petit Verdot, we've mentioned Primitivo or Zinfandel. There's some Sangiovese here. Syrah, Tannat, Trebbiano, Vidal Blanc. It is a big collection of all these different grapes, and even some local ones like Concord we've talked about doesn't make the best wine, but it's there. But there is one grape that if you want to look to kind of a DNA data or as close as we can get to being what is United States own grape that has the potential to create great wines, there's a grape called the Norton grape. So the Norton grape was introduced by Daniel Norborn Norton out of Richmond, Virginia. He selected it from what he thought were seedlings of a long forgotten grape varietal called Blonde. But it's really kind of hard to know for sure. We call the male parentage is presumed to be a wild vine. And there is a grape called Cynthiana, which closely resembles Norton, but they have often been considered separate varietals. So it's really interesting because when you talk about the two of those, genetic wise, have shown that those two are indistinguishable. The grape itself became available commercially in the 1830s and really dominated United States winemaking. Missouri, Ohio, Georgia, and like the mid-Atlantic area has always been successful with this grape. Even into today, the United States wineries along the East Coast are recultivating and producing wines from the Norton grape. I've had a couple of them and I really like it. For me, uh it gives me some almost like Zinfandel kind of vibes to it. It has this fuller, like very like jammy mouth coating that kind of hangs around. But it's a really interesting grape, and if you're trying to figure out like, hey, what would be the closest um to saying like America's grape, the Norton is probably up there. It is a hybrid, but it is one that we can claim as Americans. Um, we are lucky though, as we go into American history and wine history and alcohol history. Automatically, if you say United States and alcohol, everyone's gonna go, "Oh, uh, prohibition." Well, what about prohibition? And we almost lost Norton because of it. During prohibition, vineyards were pulled up and Concord grapes were planted in its place because at that point it's already been established that Concord makes kind of poo poo wine. So during the phylloxera, these wineries and these farmers are during prohibition, these wineries and farmers have to figure out how to stay afloat and stay alive and survive. So they pull up the Norton and plant Concord for, you know, juice and jam and the traditional things that American grapes are made for, table grapes. Um, but it really did, prohibition really did a number, especially on Eastern winemaking compared to like the Western side of the United States, like California. California's got a really unique history when you talk about prohibition. But on the East Coast, it was just all right. You know, let's just let's just be done with it. What else can we do to move on and survive? Now, it was also kind of a good thing in some aspects. You know, we talk about phylloxera and how it affected France and Italy and areas like that. And it was almost the same thing unintentionally created by prohibition. I mentioned at the beginning there's kind of like two time periods when we talk about Virginia's wine, and that is when the colonists first got here, and then fast forward to like the 80s and the 90s. So when prohibition happened, and we were still learning, but we had learned that there was some um, areas at that point that we knew weren't great for winemaking. And so when the farmers during prohibition pulled some of those grape vines out, it actually wasn't the end of the world, because when Virginia has started to slowly be resettled, it gave us the opportunity to plant what would perform better in those areas. So throughout like the 80s and 90s, a lot of wineries are starting to join in to the mix. I think there's about 160-ish in the early 2000s. By 2010, there's over 230 wineries operating in Virginia. And a lot of these are small family-owned wineries. They're not like huge, you know, gallows and things like that. But there are some very impactful uh, wineries that have come into Virginia that have not only influenced Virginia's wine, but have really made a pact on America's wine production throughout all of the history. So it's really interesting because you get all these grapes that we talk about, and you know, um, different European blends, and these Vitis vinifera has to be here because our grapes can't make great wine. And with that brought in a lot of European immigrants as well, that brought their knowledge and their expertise along with their grapes to give us even more exposure to having a jump start. I mean, you think about how many thousands of years Europe has been working with these vines, and for us to like start from square one without the European influence, we never would have been successful. I mean, we'd still be, I say still be, but we just wouldn't have caught up as quickly as we did without some of the unsung heroes, so to speak, of European influenced winemaking in Virginia. Talking about the state, we mentioned earlier a little bit about the diversity of what Virginia really has to offer. So when you get into it, there is about 4,000 acres in Virginia that are currently being planted. I think if you go on Virginia's like wine website, About Us Virginia Wine or whatever, they'll say they have over 300 wineries in the state now. In these 4,000 acres, Vitis vinifera makes up about 75% of the total production. So that is straight up European grapes, like your Cab Sauves. And then French hybrids account for about 20% of total wine production. So hybrids are when two or more species are crossed versus like just a crossing. So Vitis Lambrusca is, what we have here in the United States. Most of it is Vitis vinifera, Vitis riparia. There's a few different species, and really kind of has been broken down into where you can like truly like kind of acknowledge, okay, so Vitis ripara, they call it the riverbank grape. It's native to North America. So we can tell like what those grapes are. We know all the grapes coming out of Europe, Vitis vinifera, Vitis lambrusca, or like your Concord. I think that's why like most of the time when people talk about grapes, they typically go Vitis vinifera and Vitis lambrusca. I'm just as guilty for that. There are a lot of different species, but because lambrusca is represented by the Concord grape, it's just like one of the biggest ones out there for how it's used. There is one called Vitis rotundifolia, if I've said that right. It's a scientific name. I was never great at science, so I do apologize. But if you're from the South, you've heard of this one, muscadine. Or if you listen to country music, they talk about muscadine wine. You want to talk about something sweet. Woo! Moscato can't even get close. Muscadine, woo. Those muscadine scuppernongs, those grapes are sweet grapes. But they are turned into wine these days. Like I think of the Hinnett vineyards and the Dublin vineyards out of North Carolina. They produce muscadine and scuppernong. So if you ever get a chance, give them a whirl. Just be ready. They are not labeled as dessert wines, but there's enough residual sugar there to make it a dessert wine. So all these different grapes, 20% of those hybrids, all these different species, That's 20% of Virginia. So 75% Vitis vinifera, 20% the hybrid. So Vitis vinifera and, whatever else. Could be multiple different ones. And um, only about 5% are American varietals. In 2010, during the 2010s, the top 5 varietals produced were Chardonnay, Cab Franc, Merlot, Vidal Blanc, and Viognier. Now, that is obviously an older number. But if you look at it today, those are pretty much true. Outside of, I mentioned earlier, Petit Manseng, which is a white grape that grows primarily in southwest France. It is one of the highest quality Manseng family wines. It is a small, very thick berried skin. It's very small yields. It has to be left on the vine for a long time, or is often left on the vine for a long time to produce dessert wines. But in the US, especially Virginia, it is a perfect blend of climate for it. So it gets that ability because of how warm it is in Virginia to ripen. But with the cold winds, the quick fall that comes in Virginia, it then allows it to cool off and start to create that balance. And Virginia doesn't have an official grape. I know that they've tried a couple of times, but more and more people are leaning to just how great the production of Petit Manseng is out of Virginia. So if you get a chance, definitely check those. I love the Norton grape that we talked about earlier, but I think Virginia does some of the best Cab Francs in the world. What I love about them is if you were to go California and France, or maybe even a little into Oregon, like I like this about California Cab Franc or Oregon Cab Franc, and I love the old world Cab Franc. Virginia is that bridge, and it just creates just this picturesque version that really allows the best of both to kind of come together. And it's just the bridge. I mean, think of it as the bridge between old world and new world, what you would typically think. Some of the Chardonnays, the layers, the complexity, any grape that does well at showing its terroir, showing its sense of place, does really well. Viognier is fantastic out of here. I know a lot of people, that may not be their cup of tea, but Viognier does really, really well. So that's kind of break down some of the more popular, some of these grapes that you haven't heard of. But when we look at Virginia, I talked about all these diverse, different regions. There is also a few different areas or regions inside of France, or inside of Virginia, like you would see in France. So Virginia has 10 different regions and 8 distinct AVAs. So AVAs are a little bit like DOCs, but not as strict. We'll go through these just kind of like as just kind of a quick bullet point and highlight some of these and what they do have to offer. Some of these names you may recognize, again, especially if you are a country music fan. So Central Virginia is, as it states, kind of right there in the center of the state. It comes in off the coast. This is where the Monticello AVA is. So there's this Piedmont area here that resembles some of Europe. It is also, of course, where Thomas Jefferson was. It is on the eastern slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is fertile granite-based clay soil. Really, really probably the go-to region. There's some really great wineries out of here that I would encourage you to check out. Monticello, Barbersville, Williamsburg. Is it Williamsburg? Another region, Blue Ridge. This is an area that almost gets kind of like shared with a couple other regions. It is right up against the North Carolina border as well. It's loamy, gravelly soil, but there's actually two AVAs here. It's the North Fork of Roanoke AVA and the Rocky Knob AVA reside in the Blue Ridge. Chesapeake Bay has a really interesting AVA. We'll get to that. But this is, as it says, it's the bay. It's where colonists first came. It has been tied from the get-go. It is a mix of sandy loam soil and has more of a temperate climate year-round compared to some of the other areas. But when you talk about AVAs, most interesting name ever, the Northern Neck George Washington Birthplace AVA. That is its actual name. Really interesting. Don't know who named that one, but that is what it is. Eastern Shore. So this is a really interesting area. It is famous for wild horses that run by the sea. And Captain John Smith said this area, heaven and earth never agreed to better frame a place for man's habitation. There's a lot of things that you can do outdoors, boatings, fishing. It is a really beautiful place. But in the Eastern Shore, there's Eastern Shore AVA. Chesapeake Bay is on one side and then the ocean's on the other. So it gives you an idea of how far out that is. Hampton Roads sits kind of in the lower eastern side of Virginia. It is where Colonial Williamsburg, but the AVA here is the Virginia Peninsula AVA. Then there's the Heart of Appalachia. So this doesn't have a AVA in it. It's just kind of a region. It is right on the furthest western tip, kind of where that point of Virginia slides into North Carolina and Tennessee. This is an area that is heavily shared by those three states, and there's a lot of collaboration in sharing knowledge and growing winemaking here. The next one, probably one of the most recognizable names, just because of how it's tied to music, and that is the Shenandoah Valley. And inside the Shenandoah Valley is the Shenandoah Valley AVA. So that sits up on the northern side of Virginia, still into the Blue Ridge Mountains, up there, those Appalachian Mountains up against West Virginia. There's a highland area. They call it the Virginia Mountains. This area does not have an AVA, but they call it Virginia's Switzerland. Really interesting. And then all the way down on the southern side, up against the North Carolina border, there is Southern Virginia. No AVA here, but it kind of sits like right in the middle of the state, right up against the North Carolina border. And then not out on the coast, but up in that top, like northeast side of Virginia. They call it Northern Virginia. Um, there's a lot of high end, well respected wineries that come out of this region, in where you will find the Middleburg, Virginia AVA. It's only about 50 miles west of Washington D.C., um, right up by the Potomac River. So a lot of different areas, and as you kind of like heard me talk in those quick little descriptions, here's out on the ocean, here's up here in this mountain, here's over here by this state, and it's just really a eclectic collection of all these different wine regions that help create unique opportunities as we continue to learn American wine, but just how to be successful in an area where it's truly a labor of love, but the wines that come out of it are so unique because of how well they show off what Virginia is. Sometimes we have wines that we drink because they're a great wine, and then we have wines that like can transport you and show more than the some other parts, and Virginia wines are that. For me, when I'm looking around, it's a toss up, and I think it is not even that close of a race. But if someone was to be like, you could have $100 million, but you have to open up a winery in the United States, where are you going to pick? For me, it's either Oregon or Virginia. And I think I go Virginia because Oregon's growing and has a lot there, but Virginia has yet to fully figure out and fully reach its potential. If you look at Virginia wines from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there's some great wines there, but they were far and few between. But you look at Virginia wines now, and there are a lot of really fantastic wines. And I think as they learn more and more, I even heard a story about there's one vineyard, and when they came in, he was talking to his neighbor, and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to put this over there." He goes, "No, you don't do that." "Well, I wanted to put this here." "Nope, don't do that." And he kind of got off put at first, and he thought the guy was just kind of putting him down. And he said, "No, I've seen the worker before you put that there, and it died, and put that there." And, passing along all that invaluable knowledge, where a lot of times people wouldn't be that helpful because that's your competition. But Virginia is still so young in the wine, even though we talked about 1619 being the start of wine. It's different than it was, 400, 500 years ago compared to what they're doing now. So really be on the lookout for Virginia and how it's going to grow in the next 10, 20 years. I think we're going to see some incredible wines coming out of there. We already do, but they're just going to get more and more recognition. I know some people, I've talked to people about Virginia wines, and even, some great wines like out of Chile, and they could never produce good wines. I've had wines from there and they're not good. Look at what happened in 1976, California, Judgment in Paris, California wines, everyone stuck their nose up, and then, they sweep the floor. We can't always, especially as wine lovers, we are not doing ourselves any benefit or anything good by saying this region can't do well. A lot of times it's about finding what does work well there. And that's the bigger difference is, it costs money and it costs a lot of time, and time can't be replaced. And so that's why it can get difficult. But when you go shopping next, or you're at a tasting and someone offers a Virginia wine, I think you'll do yourselves a favor and give it a try. Look out for some of that Norton. Look out for some of that Tanat. Just a lot of great wines. And, hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. Really appreciate all your support. Be on the lookout for the newsletter that'll be coming out for all the financials backers, those subs, if you want to get a part of that. Some really cool things, some coupons for wine classes, some what am I drinking, as well as menu pairings and the ability to reach me in a quick moment's notice is all in that if you need any wine help. But that newsletter is really cool. Excited for you guys to see that and use that as a tool. But if you do want to help support us to keep the podcast going, you don't have to, but it's always greatly appreciated. The link is on all of our social medias. It's on our Buzzsprout page. It is in the show notes. I really appreciate all the support you guys give. I hope you had fun on this episode. A little bit unique in an area you might not have thought of compared to where we've been in the big regions. And so I just hope you had fun. Hopefully you'll learn something. But at the end of the day, the most important thing, you got to drink some wine. Until next time, guys. Bye-bye.